Hello, everyone. So this is the next video lecture on psychological disorders. So I'm going to dive into this in just a little bit, but what you're going to be doing is you're going to be doing this worksheet. I should have handed this to you in class. Basically, these are 11 different scenarios or situations, and you have to decide by reading the sentence, is this a normal behavior or an abnormal behavior? Normal being very typical, very average. Abnormal meaning, well, not average. So let's get into it. Actually, before we get into it, we are going to discuss tomorrow in class. For example, why you did number 1 is A and number 2 is N for normal. There is no right or wrong answer here. What's important to note is that you try your best to label this as abnormal or normal, and know that it is an inherently difficult task, and there is no black or white clear answer to any of these. So please do your best. Don't get too worried or anxious about it. Just try and make your best judgment. Tomorrow in class, we'll talk about why you decided this person was abnormal or normal in their behavior, and be able to tell me some criteria. For example, this sounds dangerous, or they were irrational. Those would be examples of criteria where you would judge how normal or abnormal the behavior is. So we'll talk about why you labeled each one normal or abnormal later. Let's get into the lecture, and you can use this lecture to help you with tonight's homework. All right. So we're going to delve into the first module of chapter 13 on psychological disorders. But before we get into there, I find it fascinating that everything we've studied so far is about normal behavior. And this chapter is about abnormal behavior, not average behavior. And even though we tend to think of psychology as being very useful in helping people with psychological disorders or mental illness, it's just one very small component of what psychology actually does. But it is a very fascinating, interesting topic. So before we can get into any psychological disorder type, we have to define abnormal behavior. So for this part, you can use some of this criteria in your activity in our discussion tomorrow. So we'll try and cover some of these topics, and we'll try and cover a little bit of Module 32 also. I'll try and breeze through these as quickly as I can. There's not a lot of slides here. So it's important to note that mental illness has been something that has been tried to be addressed and explained in the past, even going back to prehistoric times when people would cut holes in a person's skull that of a person that had a mental illness. It was believed that evil spirits were causing the mental disorder, and by cutting a hole in the skull, this process called trepanning, so right there, trepanning, it was believed that once you cut the hole, the evil spirit could leave the skull and the person would be fine. Hippocrates believed that mental illness came from an imbalance in the body's four humors. So, for example, you have bile, yellow bile, and a number of other humors or chemicals in the body. And when one of them was out of balance, it caused a mental illness. And this was a very popular theory for many, many, many years up until the Renaissance and Reformation. But in the Middle Ages, mentally ill were labeled as witches or warlocks. So it's a very fascinating history. We didn't actually have any signs of mental institutions or asylums or any sort of treatment, or have it be treated like a medical treatment until the 1700s or 1800s. And even during that time, asylums were terrible places. They were essentially prisons where people were left and essentially forgotten and chained to walls. They were very horrific places. Luckily, psychology and psychiatry has come a long way, and mental institutions are far more benevolent and humane than they once were. Psychopathology is the study of abnormal behavior. So, if you do want to study mood disorders or anxiety disorders or schizophrenia, you would want to get into the career of psychopathology. One important thing to note with abnormal behaviors is that, um, as with anything, it kind of depends on the culture. This is called cultural relativity. So the basic idea here is that when you're taking into account whether someone has a psychological disorder or whether someone is acting abnormally, you need to take into consideration the unique characteristics of a person's culture. So, for example, something that might be normal in their own culture will be perceived as abnormal in someone else's culture. There's even a more unique thing called culture bound syndromes, where these are disorders found only in a particular culture. So, for example, in some Native American cultures, there's a thing called ghost sickness. Please check it out. Basically, people with ghost sickness, it's believed that their connection between the earth and the spiritual world is being disrupted. And so they see visions of ghosts of deceased loved ones. They feel like they can see into the past or the future. Um, and traditional tribal remedies are usually used to reestablish a link between the body, the spirit, and the rest of entities in the universe. Definitions of abnormality. So there's not one unifying common definition, but there are many criteria. So abnormal is statistically rare. And when we say statistically rare, we're talking about uh, less than 2%, 2% or less of what you see in the world. So if you look at everyone who does a particular behavior, abnormal would mean the rarest of the rare, 2% or less of what you would actually see in the world. So abnormal doesn't mean weird. So for example, watching Star Trek or binging Netflix all night wouldn't be considered statistically rare, since it's pretty common people will stay up all night and binge watch on Netflix. Deviant from social norms. So this is the idea that, for example, people with a mental illness or psychological disorder will not obey social norms. So, for example, no boundaries, no personal space, will sort of get in your face and talk to you at inappropriate times, at inappropriate distances away from your face, for example. And there is, to some extent, a situational context about this. So, for example, certain behaviors that are considered normal in some situations are abnormal in others. So, for example, if I'm trying to give you a shave at a barbershop, having a knife against your neck to shave you is considered normal. But if I meet you in a grocery store and I put a knife to try and shave you in the market, that is considered very abnormal and very dangerous. And a person would be considered to have a psychological disorder. But they wouldn't be considered to have one if they were shaving you in a barbershop. Completely normal. Situational context. It depends on your situation and the context. Others include subjective discomfort and maladaptive. So, subjective discomfort means that the person having it has emotional distress or emotional pain. And maladaptive means it interferes with their ability to have a normal life, to function or to adapt and to meet everyday demands. And a psychological disorder itself can be defined as any pattern of behavior that causes people significant distress, causes them to harm others, or harms their ability to function in daily life. So any of these can be used in your homework tonight to identify whether a particular question or a particular person or scenario is abnormal or normal. Just make sure you include some of this information when you're justifying your choices. It's important to note very quickly that abnormality comes from or is caused by, can be explained by many different things. So according to the biological model, psychological disorders can be explained by the body. So changes in chemicals, the structure of the body, or genetic systems in the body. Chemical imbalances of neurotransmitters, having too much or too little hormones, um, something structurally wrong with the nervous system, or you have a genetic predisposition for a psychological disorder. Now, this is the most popular model these days, and it's a very useful one, but by no means the best or the only way of explaining psychological disorders. What it's really great at is relieving responsibility of the person. So it's no longer a person's fault for having a psychological disorder. It's not due to their thinking or their behavior. It has nothing to do with the way you were brought up or raised by your parents. It has everything to do with what is going on inside your body, which is not your fault. The psychological model is similar to psychoanalytics and Freud, and essentially there's a conflict between the unconscious and the conscious mind, and the unconscious is fighting to bring information to the conscience, and the superego is fighting back to push that information down. Biopsychosocial model is something that explains abnormal behavior by taking into account biological, psychological, social, and cultural influences. This is a more well-rounded approach. It's definitely time-consuming and not necessarily the easiest way to assess abnormal behavior, but it is a more comprehensive way to do it. The bottom line here is that abnormal behavior can be caused by multiple different things. There's no one single cause of psychological disorders. It can come from many different factors. Now, there may be one cause that is greater than others, but it's usually a collection of different causes from different areas like biology, psychology, society, or culture. Stigma. This is the sort of idea that people with a mental illness or psychological disorder, there's a sort of social disapproval. Now, this is not so common in these days, especially with the biological model, like I explained earlier. But in certain communities, like the Black community, the Latino community, or the Asian community, there is a sort of shame or disapproval or rejection that comes with a psychological disorder, and can actually bring shame to a family or shame to a person. And again, the important thing to understand here is that it's not the person's fault for having it, and this person or this person in your family needs proper treatment and help. Hopefully, in time, stigma will be reduced in all populations. Psychological disorders impact individuals and their families and society in different ways. So, for example, individuals with a psychological disorder have to cope with stigma and labels. For example, being loony or crazy or sick in the head. These are labels that are attached and are judgmental. Individuals also have to deal with the financial challenge of treatment. So paying for medicine, seeking out treatment, paying for therapy. And then friends and family have to cope with the stress of caring for this person. All of this is a stressful experience for everyone involved. But generally, people do better when they work together and they have a strong social network, social support system. These individuals and these families tend to do better when they support each other rather than when they don't support each other, or when they reject each other or judge each other for having psychological disorders. That's all I have for tonight. I was going to go into Module 32 a little bit, but not really needed. Go ahead and please do the homework for tonight. Again, the homework tonight is to put an A or an N for abnormal or normal. You can use the information from the video you just watched, play it back, repeat, pause, do whatever you need to do to help you decide whether these people are showcasing abnormal or normal behavior, and we'll talk about why you said abnormal or normal in class. Have a good night, everyone.